Let's be real. People don't hate Teruteru because he's the first Blackened. They hate him because of his personality. The harassment, the comic relief that isn't funny, the uncomfortable scenes. That's what defined him for most fans. But his murder, that's where the writing actually gets complicated. Let's break it down. 1. Sexual harassment boundary violations. Teruteru doesn't just make inappropriate jokes. He repeatedly crosses personal boundaries in ways that feel invasive and uncomfortable. He sexualizes his classmates, makes explicit comments about their bodies, and treats consent like a joke. For many fans, this goes beyond perverted anime humor and turns into behavior that feels genuinely disturbing rather than comedic, making him hard to tolerate on screen. Along with this topic, his behavior is framed as comedy, not as a character flaw with consequences. The game uses his perversion as recurring comic relief, but instead of adding humor, it creates discomfort. The jokes don't evolve, develop, or deepen his character, they just repeat, which makes his scenes feel shallow and awkward rather than entertaining or meaningful. 2. The Hajime scene. The final free time event with Hajime is where many players permanently lose any sympathy for Teruteru. The protagonist is not something most fans can interpret as a joke, and because the game doesn't treat it as serious harm, the moment feels especially tone-deaf. For a lot of the fandom, this scene alone makes him irredeemable as a character. 3. Fandom perception design bias. Some fans openly acknowledge that character design influences forgiveness. Characters who fit more traditional attractiveness standards often receive more leniency for similar behavior, while Teruteru's design makes the fandom less inclined to excuse or reinterpret his actions. This reinforces his role as an easy target for dislike within the community. Peko Pekoyama isn't controversial because of cruelty, she's controversial because of identity. Her story isn't about evil, or even choice, it's about what happens when a person is raised to believe they're nothing more than a tool. 1. Perceived lack of agency. One of the biggest criticisms of Peko is that she's defined almost entirely by her relationship with Fuyuhiko. Her tool mindset makes her feel less like an independent character and more like an extension of his story. Instead of having her own goals, desires, or worldview, her identity revolves around serving him, which leads some fans to see her more as a narrative device for his development rather than a fully realized individual. 2. Bland or emotionally distant personality. Peko's stoic, reserved demeanor makes her feel unengaging to some players. Compared to the louder, more eccentric personalities in 𝙈𝙪𝙨 Despair, her calm and serious presence can come across as flat or boring. For fans who prefer expressive or chaotic characters, Peko's emotional restraint makes it harder to connect with her on a personal level. 3. The toxic ship debate. However, some fans dislike Peko because of how her relationship with Fuyuhiko is framed. While he wants her to see herself as an equal, she refuses to view herself as anything more than a tool. This power imbalance leads some people to interpret the relationship as emotionally unhealthy, reinforcing criticism of her lack of autonomy and self-worth. Mikan Tsumiki isn't just hated, she's polarizing. For every fan who wants to protect her, there's another who finds her unbearable, uncomfortable, or disturbing. And the divide isn't about her crime, it's about how her character is written. 1. Forced fan service. One of the biggest criticisms of Mikan is how often her clumsiness is used as fan service. Her frequent falls and suggestive poses are framed in a way many players find uncomfortable, especially because she's a trauma survivor. Instead of adding depth or humor, these moments feel forced and distracting, undermining the seriousness of her character and making it harder for some fans to sympathize with her. 2. Loss of agency through Junko obsession. Her sudden devotion to Junko Enoshima is another major point of contention. Once brainwashed, Mikan loses nearly all autonomy, becoming a servant of despair rather than a person making choices. For many fans, this erases the sympathy and emotional investment they built in earlier chapters, turning her into a symbol of manipulation rather than a tragic individual. 3. The Chapter 3 writing controversy. Mikan's role as the Chapter 3 culprit is one of the most criticized narrative decisions in 𝙈𝙪𝙨 Despair. Her sudden transformation into a despair-obsessed killer is often seen as poorly executed and confusing, creating emotional whiplash. Many fans feel this twist discards her earlier characterization instead of building on it, making the trial feel unsatisfying and weakening her arc. Gundham Tanaka is one of the most beloved characters in 𝙈𝙪𝙨 Despair, but he isn't universally praised. Behind the theatrics and villain monologues, some fans see him not as a hero, but as reckless, hypocritical, and frustratingly self-indulgent. 1. Abrasive Chinibu persona, Gundam's exaggerated speech, villain monologues, and refusal to speak plainly can be exhausting for some players. While many find his theatrics charming or funny, others see them as cringy or irritating, especially during serious moments. His constant role-playing can make conversations feel unnecessarily drawn out and emotionally distant. 2. Debated heroism in Chapter 4. Although Gundam's actions are often framed as a selfless sacrifice, some fans argue his plan was dangerously reckless. He constructed an extremely complex murder that, if unsolved, would have resulted in everyone else's execution. Because of that risk, believe his actions weren't purely altruistic and may have been driven by his own desire to survive rather than solely protecting the group. Chiaki Nanami is one of the most beloved characters in the entire franchise, and that's exactly why she's controversial. As the Blackened who didn't actually commit a murder, Chiaki's role isn't about guilt or morality, but about perception, writing choices, and how the fandom reacts to characters who feel too perfect. 1. The 𝙎𝙪𝙨𝙚𝙙 accusation. One of the most common criticisms of Chiaki is that she's seen as too perfect. She's calm, rational, emotionally supportive, and almost always right during class trials. Fans argue that she lacks meaningful flaws or internal conflict, especially when compared to the more morally complex cast, which makes her feel less human and less interesting to some players. 2. Lack of on-screen character growth. Chiaki remains relatively static throughout the main story. Much of her depth and personality is locked behind optional free-time events, meaning players who don't engage with those may only see her as a helpful assistant rather than a dynamic character. As a result, some fans feel she doesn't evolve in a noticeable way. There is also that same lack of growth regarding her in Danganronpa 3, The End of Hope's Peak High School,